They filmed him crying for laughs. The clip slid across screens, a shaky phone camera, a half-empty burger bag, a circle of teens laughing. The caption blinked at the top, "Watch this deaf kid freak out." In the corner, the view count climbed, 200,000 and still rising. Hands over her mouth, translating in quick, desperate whispers. The sound of mocking laughter dissolved into a hum of notifications and outrage. In Pittsburgh, a ceramic mug met the kitchen tile. It broke. Marcus "Tank" Reeves stared at the same screen with a kind of stunned quiet that felt like an animal tensing. He didn't shout. He didn't scroll away. A name pushed up from somewhere old and tender. Cole Matthews. Tank's jaw tightened. He had seen that face before. He rubbed his palms over the worn dog tags that hung against his chest. They were the only thing he had left in Cole's handwriting, etched and dented from an explosion that had taken everything else. In Kandahar, long before the online world had learned to be cruel, Cole had reached for Tank between the smoke and shouted through the chaos, "If anything happens to me, look after Noah." Tank had gripped his friend's wrist and sworn it. How could he not? Promises made in that heady, compressed time of war carved themselves into men. They did not erode on the vine. He thumbed the letters on the tags as if reading the promise again. He looked at the video. He watched the boy sign, watched the mother translate, watched the town's response pour onto the feed, some angry, some mocking, some simply stunned. Tank felt something loosen inside him, like a long-held breath. He closed the laptop, picked up the phone, and typed into a group he'd kept for years, "Steel Vows." This is not a story about fists. This is a story about what happens when a promise meets a community determined to do better. Noah Matthews was 16. He lived in Millbrook, a small town where everybody's kids drifted into the same diner booths in high school games. He was deaf, and his mother Sarah had learned to read his face the way other mothers read a thermometer. She had been a nurse for 20 years, the kind who could hold a bandage while calming both the cut and the frightened child beneath it. Now she translated her son with a voice that trembled against the microphone as the internet replayed his humiliation. After the video, Noah stopped getting on the bus. He refused the locker room at school. He refused lunch in the cafeteria. He stopped answering the front door. Sarah watched her son shrink inside the house he had always ruled like a small, private kingdom. He met her eyes and signed less and less. Tyler Brennan, who had posted the clip, had his own phone buzzing with both praise and backlash. He was young and mean in the public way teens can be, more performative cruelty than calculated malice.
He did not anticipate the community outrage. He certainly did not anticipate the shadow of a veteran from a city an hour away, a man who kept the memory of a dead friend like an ember at his chest. Tank did not call for a fight. He did not type threats. He wrote a simple message that read like a summons to presence. "We ride to Millbrook. We go for one reason, to stand with Noah. Steel vows. Bring your patches. Bring your quiet." The replies came in a steady clack. Mercy, a nurse who ran med runs at rallies. Bishop, a school teacher who rode a burgundy Harley. Diesel, a grizzled mechanic with more soft hands than his tattoos promised. Crow, who owned a bakery and brought sandwiches. Snake, who had a law degree and a soft spot for kids. Names, faces, the ordinary patchwork of a community that had nothing to prove and everything to protect. In 24 hours, 40 people had said yes. Stay with this. It's not the story you expect. If it speaks to you, share it later. Tank rehearsed the memory of that promise like a prayer. He pictured Cole's grin, the kind of grin that could make a man feel invulnerable for a breath, and the sound of the explosion that had taken him. He had promised more than a vigil in a cemetery. He had promised he would keep a boy safe. In the years since, Tank had been a quiet man, a man who let engines speak for him. The promise lodged itself beneath his ribs and dictated a kind of loyalty that did not wait for permission. They planned not for confrontation, but for presence. In the group chat, they argued over logistics while insisting on tone. No banners, no chants, no, they typed the word reluctantly, intimidation. They would be like a lighthouse, impossible to ignore, not because they threatened, but because they would not move. There was a plan to meet outside Rosie's diner, the exact place where the video had been shot. There was a time. There was a list of things to bring. Dog tags as a symbol, bottled water, a flag, a small portable speaker tuned only to play a soft hymn if needed, not for show, but to steady anyone's nerves. Word leaked.
The town learned early that 40 motorcycles would be arriving from different states, carrying veterans, teachers, a baker, a nurse, a father who'd lost a son to overdose, and now rode to keep other kids from the edge. A few reactions were righteous. The mayor wanted to talk, the police chief wanted to meet, local reporters parked their vans. Others were fearful, imagining a different script they had seen on screens before, crowds like a threat. The sheriff's office organized a neutral presence. The town fed on rumors for a day, on speculation. People took sides in comment threads. The diner was quieter than usual. Noah sat at the window in the back of Rosie's, his hands in his lap. Sarah sat beside him and folded her hands hard to keep from signing in the middle of the restaurant. Outside, a silver pickup idled. Inside, a coffee cup went cold again and again.
The very place that had been the stage for his humiliation was now a kind of pressure chamber where the town's conscience could be inspected. Back on the highway, the first rumble was gradual, an undercurrent far enough to make the windows hum. It sounded like a distant heartbeat. The engines multiplied. It was not the hollow roar of a pack out for show, but the blend of many bikes moving with intention, an orchestra practiced in slow crescendos. They rolled through the outskirts with a discipline that surprised some of the onlookers. 60 miles on a Wednesday morning, 40 bikes wound like a slow, deliberate river toward a small town that thought it was braced for a fight. The arrival was choreographed in silence. They did not peel into the lot like a thunderstorm. They filed into the diner, parking in neat rows, and turned off engines in sequence, like instruments lowering note by note, until there was a silence so complete it landed heavy. Not one of them shouted. Not one of them made a scene. Tank swung his leg down, felt the asphalt with the old soldier's steadying, and walked without swagger toward the door. He carried a small cloth-wrapped object. The dog tags lay inside. They had come down in a pocket that had known both blood and brotherhood. Tank's fingers went over the metal, as if verifying that the promise still existed in concrete. He had told Cole he would protect Noah. He had thought he was promising something simple years ago, but obligations like that expand. They draw in strangers until they become public duty. As he opened the diner door, the room paused. Conversation folded into the hush. Sarah stood and filled Noah in quick, clipped signs. He turned like a rabbit startled, then saw Tank. Something flickered across his face. Recognition or surprise. Sarah translated. He says he knew your father. Noah's hands rose, small and cautious. He signed slowly. Sarah's voice trembled as she told the room what Noah said. Who is he? The translation was careful, because emotions were fragile. Tank knelt, which somehow felt like the right breadth of gesture, neither a show of power nor an apology, but of humility and respect. He held out the dog tags. Noah's fingers hovered. The room smelled of coffee and fryer oil, and 1,000 small habits of a town. Tank guided the metal into Noah's palm, like passing a compass. Sarah translated Noah's next sign. Why would you do this? Tank answered in a hand that had learned to be blunt and to mean what it said. He told the story of Kandahar in fragments, the way true things are told, packed with meaning, sparse on detail. He spoke Cole's name, and the room listened as if a family member had walked in. Noah turned the tags. They were cool and ridged with years. He read them the way a boy reads a new history, fingers across letters, the weight of metal against his skin. He brought them to his chest and signed to Sarah, who told Tank, who lowered his head and said the promise again. This time not to a dying man across a battlefield, but to a living boy across a diner table. I promised Cole. I promised I would look after you. There was a tenderness in Tank's voice that surprised no one more than himself. He reached awkwardly, made a small, careful attempt at a sign he'd practiced, always, and did it clumsy and real. Noah's smile was a small, private sun. He signed back, and Sarah spoke it into English. Thank you. The translation landed like a bell. This was the fulcrum moment. No violence, no humiliation returned, only the weight of someone showing up and staying. Tank's hands shook, not because he was afraid, but because he had carried the memory of a friend through so many small, lonely years. Sending 40 bikers was not about power. It was about multiplying presence until hurt felt less solitary. The town watched, and in real time learned how the story could change. Tyler and his family walked in as the room was still absorbing the exchange. He wasn't marched in handcuffed, wasn't jeered at. His face was flushed, not defiant, but ashamed in that younger, bewildered way that sometimes precedes learning. The video that had seemed like a triumph for him now soured. He had not expected such solemnity.
He had not expected the kid he'd mocked to be treated like someone the whole town owed. Tyler's apology was short. It was not a script read from a lawyer's page. He cleared his throat, and his father said, "We were wrong," in a voice that felt as if it had been scraping itself clean. The public apology that followed was not theatrical. It was quiet and sincere in its own fumbling way. "We are sorry. We didn't see the harm." He said he would take down the video and learn. Those are modest but real reparative acts. Rosie's owner, George Hiss, an older man with a permanent grease smudge on the cuff of his apron, stepped forward last. He had watched the clip too and had felt a different coil of guilt. He had allowed the mocking to happen in his doorway. He had not witnessed it as cruelty. He had not reached for the boy. His admission was a small seismic event. He said openly in front of the town and the cameras that he had failed to protect a patron on his property. He pledged to start a fund for deaf awareness and to offer Noah and his mother free meals for life. It was an attempt at repair that couldn't erase the moment, but could create new rooms in which the town could learn. The media had come with their usual hunger for spectacle. They found instead a carefully composed quiet. Reporters scribbled notes about the bikers' discipline, about Tank's promise, about the dog tags. They asked questions about possible violent outcomes. The sheriff's office answered politely. "We ensured safety. There was no need for force."
The narrative, within hours, had shifted from a viral humiliation to a story about accountability, presence, and restorative action. The bikers assembled again in the lot. Someone took a photo. No chest thumping, only a frame of bodies that did not dominate so much as protect. They formed a line at the edge of town and saluted in a way that made sense for them. A silent, respectful tilt. People marking something larger than themselves. A few of them had children along for the ride. A few were veterans who had lost more than they would say. They carried no weapons beyond a shared courage. Noah walked up to the edge of that line, dog tags heavy against his jacket. He signed, small, precise movements. Sarah translated for the crowd. He says he will come every year. It was half a joke, half a vow. Tank's lips quirked. Someone in the back clapped once, a sound that felt like permission to breathe. In the days after, the clip of their arrival would be reshared with different captions. One called them saviors. Another insisted they had simply done the right thing. The truth sat somewhere in the middle. 40 ordinary people who chose to act with restraint, dignity, and a sense of responsibility to a promise made in a far country. For Noah, the effect was quieter than the clickbait made it seem. He returned to school the week after, not because he had been rescued, but because the small island of shame that had kept him at home was not so large anymore. People waved at him instead of staring. Teachers asked staff to learn basic signing. The school scheduled a workshop. The diner put a small sign on the door reading "All are welcome," and George Hiss started calling Sarah once a week to check in. Tank drove back to Pittsburgh with the others, the engines rising in a sound that was less thunder now than a shared exhale. They dispersed on the interstate, 40 silhouettes seeding back into their various lives. A baker, a mechanic, a teacher who would later tell his students about what he had seen, a father who had held his own son tighter on the ride home. The lesson didn't end with their departure. It lived in the apology, in the fund, in the school's new sign language class, in the way a small town told itself it would try harder. There was a small epilogue that no camera captured. A week after the arrival, Tank received a handmade card left at his favorite coffee stop, tucked under a paperweight so he'd find it. Inside, in messy teenage handwriting, were 2 words and a sketch of dog tags. "Thank you," it read, and a small tug of a heart. He put the card in his pocket and thumbed it like another promise. The story spread beyond the state lines and settled into a broader, quieter conversation. People argued on feeds about vigilante morality, about escalation versus restoration. Some praised the bikers as heroes, others cautioned against romanticizing any show of force.
The facts mattered. No one was hurt. The bikers had not sought revenge. They had chosen presence, not punishment. The power of presence had been their weapon, and it did not wound. It healed in a small, stubborn patchwork way. Noah learned something else. He learned that the world could bend toward repair. He learned to trust that some people kept their promises. He learned that a small metal chain around his neck could hold a story bigger than humiliation. He kept the CAG tags close. He wore them once in a school assembly, where Tank and a few others sat in the back, like a family that had grown sideways out of a promise. Tank slept differently after that, not because his war nightmares had vanished. Old ghosts do not dissolve at a rally, but because he had acted on what he owed, and paying a debt had a peculiar clarity. He had stood between something mean and a boy who had done nothing to deserve it. The ride had been more than a journey across state lines. It had been an outward translation of an inward duty. There was one brief human moment that made the clip of their arrival feel less legendary and more honest. Tank had tried, undocumented, to learn a few signs before the day. He had practiced in the truck with a phrasebook, fingers fumbling. When he knelt and tried to sign always, he did it wrong. One small motion inverted and clumsy. Noah laughed. It was a quiet, delighted thing that made half the room smile. Sarah translated the laugh for Tank. You did it badly, but you did it. Tank blushed under his sun-darkened skin and mouthed a thank you he could not sign. It was humble, imperfect, and wholly true. The diner owner fulfilled his pledge. He sat down with the local school board and wrote a check toward a deaf awareness curriculum and a scholarship. He cleared his schedule for training days so that his staff could learn to be more inclusive and aware. He made a public apology to the Matthews family. Tyler's family donated part of the proceeds from the video, now removed, to the fund. There were other small reparations, book drives, volunteers signing up for ASL classes. The town's mechanics of repair were not neat. They were messy and human, but they moved in one clear direction. When the bikers left, they did not roar away like an army claiming victory. Their engines rose in a unified sound and then faded into the highway, less of an exit than a slow, rolling goodbye. They left something heavier than metal behind, an example that courage could take form as service rather than spectacle. A few weeks later, a local paper ran a column that tried to pin the story down in a tidy metaphor. It called the bikers a shield. Another column argued that the lesson was about accountability. Neither captured the whole. The simplest truth was this: 40 people who could have stayed comfortable instead chose to make themselves visible in defense of a quiet boy who had been reduced to a punchline. They did not mete out vengeance.
They created an opening for a town to say, "We were wrong," and then to mean it. Noah came back to the diner one afternoon and sat by the window where the original video had been shot. He signed to Sarah and then looked up when Tank walked in with an awkward, familiar gait. He held out the dog tags and placed them on the counter in front of George Chris, who reverently hung them on a small hook behind the register. There was a new placard beneath them: "For those who keep promises." It was not a shrine, it was an invitation. The rest of the story didn't end like a movie. The town was not instantly transformed into a utopia. People still made mistakes. There were still moments of meanness, and not all the lessons took root for everyone. But the arc of a painful, viral moment shifted from a spectacle of cruelty to a teachable moment of human decency. That is the triumph in the title. Not a miraculous overhaul of human nature, but the quiet, slow work of repair that followed when enough people decided that presence mattered. On the road back to Pittsburgh, Tank thought of Cole and the way promises can expand to include people we have never met. He thought of the boy whose fingers now wore dog tags like armor and memory, and something like belonging. He thought of the way a broken mug had upset his morning and ended up setting a chain of small corrective actions in motion. He didn't need to tell anyone that he felt lighter. It showed in the way he shifted his weight on the seat and smiled when a teenager from the group waved at a passing truck. He had kept a promise. The bikers vanished into highways and towns. Their leather and patches went back into ordinary lives: workbenches, classrooms, bakeries, hospital shifts. But for a small while, Millbrook had learned to look after its own differently. The video that had started it all was still out there, but now it had a new ending: a picture of a boy with dog tags, smiling, in a diner whose owner had rebuilt his conscience into fund and training. A veteran kneeling in front of a teenager, awkwardly signing always. 40 motorcycles leaving in a sound that was a kind of blessing. If there is a lesson to take from how 40 bikers changed a boy's day, it's this: what the world sometimes needs is not a loud answer, but a steady one. People who will show up, in numbers if necessary, not to punish, but to protect, not to grandstand, but to insist that dignity matters. Promise-keeping isn't always dramatic. Often it is a hand on a shoulder, a dog tag in a palm, a man learning to sign badly and smiling because he tried. The story moved across feeds and into conversations. People shared it with friends who needed to see what real strength looks like. It became a quiet model for communities wrestling with cruelty in the digital age. Presence, apology, repair.
It worked here because the bikers came disciplined and human, because the town chose to own its failures,
and because a mother kept translating her son's heart into the language of a community that had to learn how to listen. If this story tempts you to do one thing now, share it with someone who needs a reminder that presence can save. Subscribe for more stories where ordinary people do something extraordinary simply by staying true to one promise: to look after one another.